So my project is on Transcendentalism, which was a philosophical movement in the 19th century. So to understand Transcendentalism, we must first learn about where it came from. Transcendentalism was derived from the Unitarian Church. Unitarians rejected the ideas of the doctrine of the Trinity, which is seeing God as three entities, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and instead seeing God as one entity. They denied the complete sinfulness of man, meaning that they believed man was not born in sin, and they believed that a person could find God through logic, reason, and interpreting the Bible literally. Most Unitarians were wealthy and educated. Transcendentalism came about in the mid-19th century when the Unitarian Church began to reform. People wanted to get rid of the Church's reliance on logic and reason to find God and instead infuse a naturalistic view of religion. And naturalistic view of religion means the belief that morality comes from biological and social evolutions rather than the Church or religious doctrines. So basically, you're born with knowing what's right and what's wrong. So you don't need the Church to learn what's right and what's wrong. The basic beliefs of Transcendentalists are that people can go beyond their five senses to learn about the world, that people should rely on themselves rather than on religious doctrines to learn about the universe. Society and its institutions corrupt an individual's purity, and they believe everyone is spiritually equal at birth, and that people deserve to be treated with social and political equality. Some basic transcendental views are individualism/nonconformity, which means that individuals are at their best when they're self-reliant or they have their own thoughts based on their values rather than the values of others. So an example of this individualism is in Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, and the excerpt is below. So Henry David Thoreau, the author of Civil Disobedience, was jailed in 1846 after refusing to pay taxes for the Mexican-American War. In this essay, he urges people to break laws if the laws go against their values. In the selection, Thoreau is talking about how he isn't afraid of the government and that he doesn't need to rely on the government for protection. This best represents the idea of individualism/nonconformity because Thoreau made the decision to disobey the law because of his values. He describes the conformity among his neighbors, but then shows how his opinion about the government differs from that of his neighbors. This essay later inspired civil rights movement leaders to encourage others to disobey a law their conscience tells them is unjust. More transcendental values! Yay! Okay, so there is intuition, which is the idea that God is within us, and every person is born with intuition, like the idea of right and wrong. And because this knowledge is within us, people don't need to learn morality from books, society, or laws. Another idea is self-reliance, which is that our instincts help guide us toward right and wrong, and we're born pure, but when we let society influence us, we conform to society and then become corrupted. So, an idea of self-reliance, an example of self-reliance is Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance. And so the excerpt is right there. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was one of the major transcendentalists and a former Unitarian minister. In his essay, Self-Reliance, he describes the need for the individual to ignore everyone else and listen to their inner soul. In the passages, Emerson describes the evils of society and how it can corrupt an individual. He also describes that shutting out others' opinions can make a man great. This essay outlines the principles of self-reliance in that an individual's instinct rather than the outside influence is what makes him great, and that society is a corrupter. Self-reliance influenced in civil rights movement leaders to trust their instincts and do what they feel is right rather than what society tells them to do. The next value is idealism, which is the idea that humans are born naturally good, but society corrupts us and makes us bad. Transcendentalists don't believe in materialism because they believe that wanting material goods is worthless and a waste of time because money makes us place a false value on objects and people. One of the most important transcendental views is the divinity of nature, which is the idea that we should live closer to nature because nature is our teacher and it brings us closer to God, and if one has a strong connection with nature, one will live a successful and complete life. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote an essay about nature. Surprise, surprise. It's called Nature. So the excerpt is below. So Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote this essay in 1836. In it, he describes the divinity of nature and how studying it can bring one closer to God. In this selection, Emerson is describing how God is within nature and that being in nature makes you one with God. He also describes that being alone in nature can help you discover yourself. This is important because it shows the importance of nature to the transcendentalist, and that the idea of all nature is connected to God. Therefore, being connected to nature equals being connected to God. Another idea is the idea of the oversoul or the universal soul. So according to dictionary.com, the definition of the oversoul is the spiritual unity of all beings. So it's the belief that every individual is connected with every living thing in the universe, and that every individual is to be respected because everyone has a portion of this oversoul. So Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote an essay called Oversoul, which is about the oversoul. In the Oversoul, Emerson gives a description of the Oversoul and its application to life. In this selection, Emerson is describing how God is within an individual. Because God lives inside of us, we are all equal. He also states that although each person is an individual, everyone is part of the collective soul. This essay describes what the Oversoul is. It's important because it inspired African Americans and women to fight for their rights because the belief in the Oversoul made them believe that they were equal instead of inferior to everyone else. So this is a biography of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an important person in the Transcendentalist movement.
There are three main Transcendentalist authors which we will be talking about in this video: Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now let's start with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Mr. Emerson was born on May 25, 1803, in the Puritan New England town of Boston, Massachusetts, to Ruth Haskins and Unitarian minister William Emerson. Young Ralph had a strict but loving upbringing in the household of a minister who died when he was just 8 years old. It was the first of many untimely deaths of Emerson's relatives. While his father had died young, he was very close to his mother's siblings and Aunt Mary Moody, who had a great and positive influence on his intellectual growth. Early on, young Waldo, as he liked to be called, started keeping journals and later would base many of his essays on his thoughts and observations expressed therein. While his writings were sometimes criticized as being too abstract, he was an eloquent and popular speaker. After studying the classics at the Boston Latin School, Emerson enrolled in Harvard College, graduating in 1821. He then taught at his brother William's Boston School for Young Ladies. On September 30th, 1829, he married Ellen Louisa Tucker. She died of tuberculosis a few years later, and her death caused another wave of religious questioning and doubt for Emerson. He next married Lydia Lydian Jackson on September 14th, 1835, with whom he would have 4 children: Waldo, Ellen, Edith, and Edward. They settled in Concord, Massachusetts, where they would live for the rest of their lives, their home now the National Historic Landmark Ralph Waldo Emerson House. In 1832, Emerson sailed for Europe. His health had been troubling him for some time, and he was advised to take a rest. He visited England, Scotland, France, and Italy, meeting poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth, and philosophers John Stuart Mill and Thomas Carlyle, with whom he maintained a lengthy correspondence published as Correspondence of Thomas Carlyle and N.R.W. Emerson. Emerson had been lecturing for some time, and in 1838 made his controversial Divinity School address at Harvard, whereupon he was labeled an atheist. In 1840, he started the magazine known as The Dial, with Margaret Fuller, which served as the official publication of the Transcendentalists until 1844. Emerson was a prolific essayist. Many of them first appeared in the Dial, many of them were lectures he had given. In 1872, the Emerson family sailed for Europe and Egypt, while their home, badly damaged by fire, underwent repairs. When they returned, Emerson continued to write and address students and admirers alike. At the age of 78, Emerson caught a cold from being out in the New England rainy damp weather, and it turned into pneumonia. On April 27, 1882, Ralph Waldo Emerson died at home in Concord, Massachusetts. Lydia survived him by 10 years and now rests beside him on Arthur's Ridge in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord, Middlesex County.
The way Transcendentalists shared their ideas was through a magazine called The Dial. So Ralph Waldo Emerson often invited men and women who shared his beliefs to his home to discuss ideas, and they discussed ways to develop a more fulfilling spiritual life for individuals and society, and they called themselves the Transcendental Club. They published their ideas in a magazine called The Dial. It was edited by Margaret Fuller, and it ran for 4 years. So this is an excerpt from The Dial. It's entitled Women in the 19th Century. Margaret Fuller was the first editor of The Dial and an advocate for women's rights. In the selection, she describes the idea of self-reliance and that man is the cause of lack of self-reliance in women because man expects woman to follow his rules rather than let woman be guided by her own values. This shows how transcendentalist ideas were spread through the magazine, and this article inspired women to seek their rights and look inside themselves for guidance rather than look to man. The effects of transcendentalism are huge because the ideas about equality sparked women's rights advocations, and it also inspired African Americans to fight for their rights. The ideas of civil disobedience inspired Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, who often fought peacefully using the technique. So there was a lot covered in this PowerPoint, and it's a lot of weird, radical ideas, so this video is a recap of everything in the PowerPoint.
So say you're me, and it's the night before your AP Language and Comp exam. You've done your studying, but for the life of you cannot remember what each of the American Lit periods are. Well, I don't know about the others, but here's a refresher course on one of them. So here we've got Transcendentalism. The period started in 1836 and ended just about 1861. The deal is, at the time, some people were really upset with the way the Unitarian Church was running things, so instead a group of people turned to nature, which is why we have a tree, a check mark, and a rather large smiley face. Basically, what they believed was that any individual was greater and more powerful than an institution, and that inside of every person's head was God's secret voice, so there was no reason for a church. Naturally, this group of people got together and started a club, and like any other club, they had rules. First of all, they believed that basic truths could be found through your intuition, which means you don't learn how to know things, you just know already. They also believed that an inner soul will lead to the truth. They believed that individual relationships with God were much better than anything you could get through an institution like a church, and they also believed that nature was basically self-knowledge. The oversoul was what they called the combination of every god from every religion, and it's what they believed in. They also said that all nature is significant, and they promoted individualism. They also found the goodness of nature everywhere. So basically, what every transcendentalist believed was that your mind is all a person needs to figure out the great mysteries of life. You don't need somebody teaching you something, and you don't have to learn something to figure it out. You're basically born with the knowledge. So you don't need logic either. They also believed that at birth there wasn't the whole tabula rasa idea, but that instead of being nothing, the mind itself was the mind, which basically flew in the face of everything everyone was saying these days, including the great philosopher John Locke. But it kind of does make sense in a weird way, doesn't it? So now we have the people who started this Transcendental Club, which we'll call our main Transcendentalists. First off, we have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who basically got the whole movement started. Yes, that's right, we did find Waldo. Emerson wrote primarily journals and lectures, which he gave on a regular basis. His most famous work is Nature, which he published in 1836. He also helped found the Transcendentalist magazine, which was called The Deal, and then died in 1882 of pneumonia. Emerson's style is very distinct. His sentences are clear, but when put into paragraphs, they can be somewhat confusing. He mostly wrote about his observations, which is what a journal is. He was also quietly optimistic usually, and mostly wrote poetry with just a little bit of prose mixed in. Next, we have Henry David Thoreau, the other very well-known author of the Transcendentalist period. He mostly wrote about natural history and philosophy, and composed a set of essays which went into Walden, which was published in 1854. Walden was about his times living alone in a shack next to Walden Pond. There's Thoreau, and there is his awesome hair. Now, I know you're tired of hearing boring old facts by now, so it's story time. Basically, how it goes is around the time the Civil War was starting, Thoreau was very, very upset about this. So upset, in fact, that he refused to pay his taxes. And when you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail. So when he was sitting in jail, he got to thinking about what he was doing and coined the phrase nonviolent civil disobedience. Think back all the way to your history class and remember what that means. Sound familiar? Remember the campaigns for African American rights in the 60s in America? Remember the names? Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. What about over in India, how Mohandas K. Gandhi was fighting for independence without actually fighting? See? Influence. Lastly, we have Margaret Fuller, who was our lone female in the Transcendental Club. She was, of course, a feminist, and the editor of The Dial, which was the Transcendentalist magazine. Her work, Woman in the 19th Century, was considered the first major feminist work, at least in America. She later died in a shipwreck in 1850. Her body has never been found. Margaret Fuller's style is overly complicated, and being an AP language, we have a word for that. It was pedantic, to say the least. Sorry for almost misspelling that. She was usually critiqued more on her conversation and personality, which were both willful, strong, forceful, and generally well received. In summary, the goal of every transcendentalist was to relate all individuals to both the natural world and the world they had inside themselves, their inner world. In order to illustrate this, we'll have a leaf, and then a head, a body, some continents, some water. Boom, inner world.
Yay, we're done.